All right, let's just dive right in, because today we are unpacking a 10,000-year-old scientific detective mystery, and this one is literally buried deep in the frozen permafrost of the far north. We're looking into the Alaskan muck mystery. If you're a focused learner who loves dissecting a really good scientific debate, you are in exactly the right place. Today in this explainer, we are unpacking an enduring, fierce conflict over what actually happened at the end of the last ice age.
And that brings us right to the ultimate question we have to answer. What killed the Alaskan megafauna? Look, we're talking about entire populations of massive, towering beasts, creatures that dominated the landscape for millennia, and then they just suddenly vanished. Was it a sudden cataclysm, or was it the slow, grinding march of time and climate? To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of what scientists are arguing about here, we've got to travel back to the late 1930s and 1940s, right to the front lines of the Alaskan gold rush.
University of New Mexico archaeologist Frank Hibben painted a pretty wild picture of this scene at these gold mining excavations. He wrote, "The stench could be smelled for miles around, the stench of some hundreds of tons of rotting mammoth meat, 10,000 years old." I mean, just imagine being a miner or a researcher out there in the 1940s. You aren't just finding old, dry bones. You're unearthing an ancient ecosystem that was so rapidly and violently frozen that flesh, skin, and hair are literally still preserved. It's gritty, it's visceral, and it completely demands an explanation.
So the crucial point here is that this discovery kicked off a massive ideological tug-of-war between two different scientific camps. In one corner, we have catastrophism. This is the theory that a sudden, violent, single cataclysmic event wiped out all these animals. In the other corner, we have uniformitarianism, which basically argues that geological changes in fossil deposits are the result of slow, gradual, episodic accumulation over millions of years. Keep both of these frameworks in the back of your mind as we go through the evidence.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, we really need to define our crime scene. Alaskan muck is this overburden of frozen silt that lies right above the gold-bearing gravel beds, and it is absolutely packed with animal bones, debris, and these giant ice lenses. Now, the gold miners, they didn't care about the muck at all, right? They just wanted the gold underneath it. So they used these massive hydraulic jets, basically giant water cannons, and accidentally sluiced away all the dirt. And in doing so, they revealed this completely frozen, hidden world.
And the sheer variety of life frozen in this stuff is just staggering. We aren't just talking about a couple of stray mammoths here. We've got woolly mammoths, mastodons, super bison, prehistoric horses, saber-toothed tigers, camels, and extinct bears and lions. All of these incredibly diverse species were found completely unexpectedly, just jumbled up and frozen together in the exact same silty grave.
So early researchers, guys like Frank Hibben and Froelich Rainey, they looked at this chaotic mix and came to a pretty stunning conclusion. In his field notes, Hibben describes twisted and torn trees piled in splintered masses, and he points out that mammal remains are for the most part dismembered and disarticulated. He even called it a grim charade, like these animals were frozen mid-motion. For those early catastrophists, this violent, splintered imagery was absolute proof that these creatures died suddenly in some massive, unexplained prehistoric disaster.
But, as with any good scientific investigation, we have to look at the other side. And that brings us to the uniformitarian counterargument. Modern geologists, particularly critics like Paul Heinrich, they look at those exact same deposits and argue that the whole catastrophist narrative of a sudden, dramatic end is, well, frankly, imaginative fiction. They argue that if you actually look closely at the geology, a totally different story emerges.
To really get this counterargument, we have to zoom out and look at deep time. Using modern dating techniques, geologists have figured out that this muck isn't from one single event at all. The Dawson Cut forest bed dates back almost 2 million years. The Eva forest bed, that's from about 125,000 years ago, which is way too old for a terminal ice age catastrophe. And the youngest deposits formed as recently as 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. So they argue this proves the muck formed episodically over millions of years, separated by long stretches where absolutely nothing happened.
To sum up this modern perspective, geologist Paul Heinrich says that the muck consists of well-defined geological layers, a well-ordered layer cake sequence of stratigraphic units. I want you to contrast that with Hibben's description of twisted trees and jumbled bones. Heinrich is telling us that, sure, apart from a few surface disturbances like landslides, the geological record is actually highly structured, it's mappable, and it's completely orderly. Basically, no cataclysm required.
Now, if you just read Heinrich's critiques, you'd probably think that catastrophist theory was totally debunked. I mean, he cites a mountain of peer-reviewed papers to prove Hibben wrong. But here on The Explainer, we like to dig a little deeper.
So I want you to play peer reviewer with me for just a second. What actually happens when we dissect the scientific debate and put those specific citations to the test? Well, an independent investigation into Heinrich's sources found a pretty surprising twist. Papers by Bettis, Busaka, and Moose were specifically cited by Heinrich to debunk Hibben's catastrophist claims. But here's the wild part. When you actually sit down and read them, they don't even mention Frank Hibben. Some of them don't even mention the Alaskan muck deposits at all. And it actually gets even more complex. Heinrich confidently claims that modern papers have shown the descriptions made by those early researchers concerning the sheer abundance and distribution of fossil bones to be grossly exaggerated and quite inaccurate. He's essentially saying that Hibben totally made up the idea that the muck was packed with massive quantities of bone.
But let's actually look at one of the main sources Heinrich cites to prove this so-called exaggeration, a 1975 study by Troy L. Payway. When we pull the direct quote from Payway's study, here's what it says. The greatest collection of vertebrate specimens is from the Fairbanks area, where tens of thousands of specimens have been collected during the past 30 years. So incredibly, the very paper being used to discredit the abundance of bones actually confirms that there were in fact tens of thousands of specimens. And Payway's study goes even further. It gives us a very specific, staggering number, 8,008. That is the exact number of catalog vertebrate specimens collected by researcher O.W. Geist from the Fairbanks area alone in the year 1938. And Payway specifically makes a point to note that 1938 was just a typical year.
Now, what does 8,008 specimens actually look like? That is literally 8 solid tons of bones collected in a single year and shipped off to the American Museum of Natural History. So when Frank Hibben originally wrote that the Alaskan muck was packed with animal bones in trainload lots, it turns out he wasn't grossly exaggerating at all. The uniformitarian sources inadvertently validate the catastrophist's raw data regarding just how unbelievably massive the scale of these remains really was.
So this leaves us in a really fascinating scientific stalemate, an ideological tug-of-war in our search for the ground truth. On one side, we have solid proof that mammoths lived in this region for tens of thousands of years, which absolutely supports the gradual, episodic accumulation of remains. But on the other side, we have heavily validated accounts of thousands of tons of jumbled, dismembered bones rapidly frozen into the muck. So, does this rule out a single cataclysmic event causing their final extinction? The exact nature of how they met their end remains a fiercely debated puzzle.
And by the way, this phenomenon isn't just isolated to the Fairbanks district in Alaska. The mystery stretches right across the border. The adjoining Canadian territory of Yukon continues to yield huge numbers of these megafaunal fossils, and they are still being sluiced out of the muck by modern gold mining operations to this day. The footprint of this puzzle is absolutely massive.
Which brings us to the ultimate question I want to leave you with today. In the fierce ideological struggle between catastrophism and uniformitarianism, have we blinded ourselves to the ground truth? When scientists are passionately committed to a gradual, uniformitarian view of history, do they sometimes ignore or dismiss evidence that looks a little too catastrophic? Understanding this material isn't just about ancient mammoth bones, right? It's really about understanding how the lens of modern science interprets our ancient past. Take this question with you, keep examining the sources, and definitely stay curious. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.